Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I have Menno Henselmans back on the podcast. We're going to do a really cool Q&A. I gathered questions from across the social media, and we have some really cool questions to dive into. So first of all, though, Menno, I've been doing this with a few guests lately who have been on the show a few times. I don't know how people like it, but hopefully people will respond and let me know. But just like an update on kind of where you are as an individual in terms of like, I know you lift, you like training, you've competed. Have you competed before? You've got into competition shape. I know that for fact, and I think you did compete. Where are you right now with everything in your own kind of personal bodybuilding endeavors?
Probably not going to compete anytime soon again. It's just too much stress on work. Actually, I prefer photo shoots. Like if I'm going that route, like you create something permanent. I like that. Let me show. You also have photos, but it's a hit or miss if they, what the lighting is like and everything. I'm bulking at the moment. I actually tried basically the whole, almost 1.5 years. I've mostly bulked and doing everything like very optimally. Made a few changes as well to some of the things I did nutrition-wise. Like I used to like being at a very low body fat percentage, stay there very long term. And for convenience sake, had 2 meals a day. But like looking at my results, I'm actually thinking it might be a bit more detrimental than I thought to have just 2 meals. So I think I'm actually in pretty good shape muscle-wise. Like I'm at like with a little bit of bulk now. I'm cutting, just doing a mini cut. I'm at 92 kilos. I'm at like 95 when somewhat bulked up, which is not as lean as people are. As I'm used for, or as I'm known for, but it's still, I still have abs. And that's pretty good. I'm actually pretty happy with that. I think I'm actually up at least a pound or a kilo compared to before the bulk. And I think that's mostly due to the nutrition side, like the meal frequency. And before that, I may have actually spent too much time staying really lean. Like I was probably spent maybe a good year or so at like 7% body fat. And I think that I may have actually taken a toll, like not contest shape, but not far off from it. And actually, when I did the video with Jeff Nippert in Bali, I was like, yeah, I used to look better. So
yeah, it's actually really cool hearing what you're doing, because obviously you stay up to date with what's going on. You're obviously a coach as well, so you're helping people try and get there, and you're known for trying to do things optimally. So it's interesting to hear like you're even experimenting, trying new things. I think I've heard you think at least that you're very close, and I guess it's no secret that you're very close to your genetic limit. But it's cool to know that you've maybe gained some muscle mass just through kind of some and nutritional tweaks, which I mean, nutrition I would say is generally one of the ones that for most people I hope is a little easier. So was it just the protein frequency dosing through the day that you changed mostly there?
Yeah, I think that has had the biggest impact, plus maybe detrimental effects of long-term being very lean.
Yeah.
So I think one of those, that's the thing with anecdotes like NS1, you never know, because I changed both at the same time.
Yeah.
So you never know which one was which had more of an effect.
And
but
you
the 2 meals was also like this last year, like 6 months ago or so, there was actually a study that came out showing that even if you have a very small third meal, it's probably not optimal. Like you actually need 3 substantial protein servings per day to get maximum gains.
Okay. No, yeah, really interesting. And then just out of interest, I think you tend to have a smaller surplus. That tends to be your recommendation for more advanced trainees. Is that right? Is that how you went?
Like lean bulking.
Yeah.
Like keeping it very lean. Not like, I do think a lot of people also, especially when they've become really lean, it's sort of addictive and they're too hesitant to bulk up. I see that a lot in clients. Once they've tasted the shreds, then, you don't want to lose it. But if you try to, basically, you're barely gaining weight. Like if you're not gaining weight, you're not getting muscle. So you do have to be putting on weight. But I do think that as a general rule of thumb, if you see objective increases in body fat, like 2 weeks in a row, it's probably too much.
Okay. And do you measure that generally visually as well for body fat, or do you do calipers?
Yeah, I like calipers, but using specific methods and instructing people how to use them and using the right ones is very important. Calipers probably I'm the most fan of. Waist circumference is actually not too bad, but someone has to have a steady diet. Otherwise, with bloating and if they have like GI issues, then that can really skew with the waist measurements.
Yeah. And you're quite tall as well for people referencing your weight. You're over 6 foot?
I'm 6'1".
6'1", cool. Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, it spreads it all along.
5'8", 95 kilos would be nice.
Yeah, very nice. Awesome, Menno. I think, well, yeah, I want some feedback from the listeners so they can let me know if they enjoyed kind of just getting an update on where you're at. But so the first question that we've had come through was from Brett McGee, and he has asked, I would like to know if there is any exercise science or nutrition research that is currently in the works or planning to be studied that's surprising or interesting to him. So anything interesting in the works?
There are a few things that it depends on what you mean by like in the works. Like what I have personally in the works, I have a study on intermittent fasting that's delayed due to Corona. We lost one of the cohorts, which really sucked, but I think that's going to be this year, like late this year, probably, that we publish it. Diet break study, I've talked a bit about that before, and it's basically echoing the results of the last diet break study, which wasn't too positive. Our results are very similar. In terms of upcoming research, actually, I think the Corona kind of has had a negative influence on the research state. One of the many side effects, because if you look at the amount of papers published, it's definitely a bit less than normal, I'd say, especially in terms of the things we really find interesting, which makes sense, just like our study. Yeah. If you have a cohort, like longer term study, strength for knees, where it's very important that everything's the same, they're tracking their nutrients, their macros, then if Corona happens, basically your study validity goes right out the window.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, out of interest, Menno, so your diet break study, it hasn't been published yet, has it?
Not yet. No.
Can I ask questions about it at all, or
a little bit? Yeah, but it's probably going to be published, or we're submitting it for publication. Bill Campbell's like working on the last edits.
Okay.
We have another round because we're almost ready for publication, but then the other diet break study got published, so we want to test it with those findings, etc. And I think Bill has another few things he wants to make clear, but cool. We're in the last edit round. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess actually my question might be not totally specific to that study. I had Jackson on talking about his, and I'd love your view on, because his cohort, they were kind of lean males. I'm not sure how lean, like in your head, you're like in my head, I was like, they're like 18% body fat or something. So I was like, that's not that lean. Were your guys, and maybe girls in there as well, were they leaner? And do you think if they weren't, or if you think people were leaner, do you think that there would be differences for the diet breaks? Do you think they'd be like, I don't know, even negative or positive? What do you think might happen?
Yeah, we didn't select a specific population for this, like obviously strength trained, but not a specific body fat range. So it's quite different. Yeah. I don't think we had anyone in like contest. That's actually also hard because they usually differ from other people. So if you do a study on competitors, it's often a study exclusively on competitors. It would be interesting to see if the findings differ, but as a general rule of thumb, I think if you don't have a very good reason why results would differ due to some factor, in research, you actually often see that they don't. Like maybe it's like interaction effects are actually quite rare in general. Like something causes an effect and another thing may also have an effect. But when there's an interaction between two things, you actually don't see that too often in biology. So I don't think it would have a massive difference.
Yeah, kind of the conclusion me and Jackson somewhat came to was you could almost, rather than extending your diet using those on the kind of within that phase of a contest prep, you could almost save them and use it towards the end of a prep, like eating up into shows, potentially reversing out if you were ready early, which, it sounded like a more favorable strategy. And I know people use it.
I'm actually a fan of that. If you have time, then it's also like psychologically, as long as you're staying lean and like the last weeks when you're increasing energy intake, you just feel much better. And I think for a lot of people, especially for female competitors, if you just have higher well-being and confidence for something like bikini or men's fitness model, your overall appearance and, outlook, how you carry yourself is actually very underrated, I feel. It's not like, even with bodybuilding, it matters probably more than people think because, we're humans. We don't see We're not like a DEXA scanner that just goes like,
Yeah.
total fat-free mass, rank them. You see an individual, and if they look gaunt and like, they're just standing there, and they're shredded, but they also look like they're about to die, then you probably just don't evaluate it that positively. Whereas if someone's like, this radiant bloom of well-being and muscularity, then they just catch your attention more. I think even for the bodybuilding class, but especially for like bikini and men's fitness, it has a big impact.
Yeah, I can definitely attest to that. And the nice thing, I guess someone might argue the diet breaks are like practicing maintenance. So at the end of the diet, it becomes easier to transition. But also with the reverse kind of calories, you're kind of at maintenance near enough towards the end. So it's like a nice transition towards then getting into a bigger surplus to like recover after the show and things. So yeah, it's cool to know that you're also kind of, you like that approach as well, because it's nice when people align with their ideas, especially smart people who've come about it from a different angle. So that's really cool. He had a second question, and that was, why do certain people seem to have more adaptive metabolisms when it comes to cutting and massing than others? Is there a mechanism or a type of gene that would influence this?
Yeah, there have been some genes identified. It's mostly correlational, so I'm not sure if that, all it shows is that it's additional support that yes, there is actually genetic variability in terms of how adaptive our metabolisms are. I always use myself as an example of very adaptive. Like I have to, for contest leanness, photo shoot leanness, I have to get to 1900, at some point even 1800 calories a day. Like legitimately nothing happens if I stay at 1900. And interestingly, it's another topic that I've presented about a few times in recent webinars. Cardio also does nothing for me at that body fat percentage. Like I can be at 1900, and I would not have believed this myself if I had not experienced it before. I do 30 minutes of cardio a day, every single day for a week. Still nothing happens. I go to 1800 calories, I lose fat, like consistently. So there is a lot of variability. And when I'm bulking, I can go up to 4,000 easily, closing it on 5,000 if I'm also pretty active and I bicycle to the gym. And there is of course a weight differential. It's at some point almost 10 kilos, but it's still a massive difference. You're literally talking about almost 2.5 times the energy intake when cutting versus bulking.
Yeah.
Whereas other people, I have one client, for example, who I think he like cuts on 2,300 and bulks on 2,800.
Wow.
So it's very little difference. And if we actually with some clients, I don't bother to make 50 calorie differences in energy intake because it's within the margin of error. If your scoops are a bit bigger than you think, but for him it makes a significant, consistent effect every time.
Wow.
50 calories difference, but it's like there's almost no adaptation. And most research points towards NEAT/SPA, so non-exercise activity thermogenesis / spontaneous physical activity, which is the movement you make when it's not very conscious, like I'm moving my hands now. Those kind of movements explain the most. So that's basically superfluous, redundant movement. And some people are more sparing with that than others, whereas others are very liberal. And typically also, if you get to a higher body fat level, the body becomes a lot more liberal with its energy expenditure. Whereas if you get very lean, you can actually notice, especially if you get contest lean, you become more like a zombie, and your movements are really restricted to the bare essentials.
Even down to, like you said, even how you hold yourself, like posture-wise, and like even like your gesture, like your facial expressions. I've even seen it with competitors where they're just kind of like minimal movement as much as possible. And actually, this brings me to a question. A lot of people talk about kind of when you're contest lean being quite cold, and they put it down to like the body fat. And I've always thought, I think body fat may influence it. Oh, I'm sure it does, but I've always thought it maybe is more adaptive of your metabolism, like just keeping you cooler. Is that right? I don't know.
Yeah, there are probably a few factors, and I've experienced this myself very much. Actually, when I went on surfing holidays during college, I could really notice what body fat percentage I was based on how cold I was in the water. So for one, there's less insulation. I'm not sure how much of a difference that really makes. Like if you compare an obese individual with someone shredded, yeah, it's going to make a difference. But within say 12 to 8% body fat, you're really not talking that much insulation. So I don't think that's the main thing. There is a thermogenic effect for sure. And that's both adaptive thermogenesis and also the thermic effect of food. So typically, when you're leaner, you're also eating less. And as basically anyone can attest, if you eat very large meals, you typically get warmer and sometimes even like sweaty, and especially if it's warm food. So I think those factors together can actually explain pretty well why people are quite reliably more sensitive to cold when they're leaner.
Yeah. I think I've seen someone somewhere talking about kind of taking morning body temperature as like a gauge of how much your metabolism has suppressed. Have you heard of that?
I've tried that as well.
Okay.
I know Birger Fagerli did a lot of experiments with that in Norway with his clients. It doesn't correlate that well.
Okay.
For one, oral temperature, or however you measure temperature, does not correlate that strongly with core body temperature. Like you need to do the rectal measurement.
Right.
But even if you do that, body temperature, like internal body temperature, is not nearly as strongly correlated as you would think with metabolic rate.
Interesting.
So me, for example, even when I'm very at a very high energy intake, like 4,500 plus, my normal body temperature is often 36.6 or so, which is actually below normal. Like normal is like, most people say 37, but I think it's 36.8 in research, or maybe even a little less. And mine's like, 0.2 below that. I have a fever. If I have 37, which most people would say is normal, I have a fever. So I think for a lot of people, you see that the measures are quite different. Plus, they also don't change that much over time. Like someone's body temperature may stay almost the same throughout contest prep with like minimal effect, whereas their metabolism tanks quite hard.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it's always something. I'm similar to you in that I adapt hard down and quite hard up. Maybe not quite as extreme as you do, because I think yours is a little bit more extreme than mine. And I wonder if actually, I wonder what your take on this would be. I was just thinking for like genetics for bodybuilding, being less adaptive to me sounds like a favorable thing, because then massing is comfortable and it doesn't get, I don't know how uncomfortable you get, but my appetite to keep up with 4,000 plus calories is not fun. And then obviously cutting on less food is never a fun thing. So yeah, would you agree with that?
Definitely. My appetite's also hugely adaptive. When I'm lean, I literally have the largest appetite relative to body mass of anyone I know. I'm even not relative to body mass, actually. There's always, when I have my PT courses, we do one meetup, or pre-corona we used to do, when people from all over the world fly to usually Amsterdam, and we have a day with like seminars, and then afterwards we go out for all-you-can-eat sushi. There are always a few people that are like, oh, I know Menno likes sushi, so I'm going to challenge Menno and see how much we eat. And I'm always like, sure, let's do it. And I just eat normal, and I eat lots of like fillers and veggies to make sure I don't eat as much. And then usually what happens is at some point they're like, oh my God, I'm full. So, okay, so I give up, and then I'm still eating for another half hour. But that's when I'm bulking, especially the past year, when I'm bulking like long-term and like 6 months of 4,500 plus calories, yeah, it becomes force feeding. Like I'm using shakes, and it's not fun anymore.
Do you have like, what are your strategies? Like, is it liquid calories? Do you kind of try and avoid as many whole foods? I guess fiber, you keep that under control. Is there any strategies you have?
I want to keep it super healthy. Actually, I have a big genetic risk of cardiovascular disease.
Okay.
So genetically, I want to keep it super, super healthy. I actually notice, like, if I eat more saturated fat, my cholesterol goes bad really quickly, much more quickly than you would expect, and much more quickly than I see my own clients often. So I keep it super, super healthy. Still want to get the fiber in. Almost always just whole foods. Like white rice for me is like as cheat food as it gets. And that complicates things. Yeah. So lots of nuts, lots of liquid calories. If you tolerate chocolate, which for me is like acne breakout instant, but if you tolerate chocolate, then chocolate's great. And chocolate with nuts and just mashing it together, like hazelnuts, chocolate, some sweetener, and just make like a big bowl. That can be like a 1,500 calorie, just chocolate hazelnut bowl. That works well. Making sure you start eating early, because for me, I don't have any appetite in the morning. Like I respond super well to intermittent fasting, which is why I did it a long time. But when bulking, it's basically, If it's 12 and I'm like, I haven't eaten breakfast yet, then this is going to be tough.
Yeah.
So that really has a big effect. In general, I'd say that very high meal frequencies make it a bit easier to eat enough, because especially when you're cutting, you can just eat yourself until you're like really full. But when you've passed that point while bulking, afterwards it just becomes much more dreadful for the rest of the day. Whereas if you're just like constantly full, okay, full, a bit less full, it's fine. But once you've hit that point where you're like, I really don't want to eat anymore, then it becomes extra tough.
Yeah.
And just some foods that you really like for me, sushi, for example, it's not that energetically dense, but I can eat so much sushi. Like white rice for me is just, I can just keep eating it, and 2 hours later I can eat more.
I guess that's why it's a big bodybuilding food. Like, it's like rice is just like, and I guess it's like for a lot of people, they digest it well. So I think that also comes in.
I think actually FODMAPs are a very big issue in what people consider like a clean foods. Like white rice is something basically nobody has adverse GI reactions to, whereas a lot of other foods, so broccoli is a bit mixed actually, but some other foods, you don't see many bodybuilders eat cabbage, for example, even though it's super satiating, super nutritious, super cheap, so objectively it's great gut food, but a lot of people get very severe GI issues. I think that's also the reason like lactose intolerance is quite prevalent, especially in the US. And in the world at large. Lactose, most of the population, I think, like of the entire world population, is lactose intolerant. And I think that's a big reason that dairy was thought of as a non-clean food, even though research shows like, it's super high protein quality, it's quite satiating, it has the calcium, which is good for muscle contractility and satiety. And it's quite satiating, pretty affordable, easily accessible. You can either have it in liquid form and then bulk, or you can have like the thick quark or cottage cheese, and then it's great for cutting. But it's still sort of shunned by the traditional bodybuilding community, and I think that's in large part due to lactose intolerance, because you eat it, you get digestive issues, you get bloated, and people mistake that for fat gain.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would definitely concur with that. And I found not this time I've been cleverer, but the last time I was massing and I got to this point, I was relying a lot on like dairy basically, and having like chocolate milk to get the calories in, and I just felt not great. And then I kind of assessed my diet, and I was like, oh, I'm having a lot of lactose. So I found reducing that down helped quite a lot. So yeah, once you do get to the number of calories you're on, like you have to pay attention to if things don't sit well with you. You can't afford to have that in your diet because you can't eat anymore once you've had it.
It's funny with lactose tolerance how much that how regional that is. So I'm Northwestern European, so I can literally drink a liter of milk and zero issues. So if you go to like Scandinavia, I've heard some people say when you mention lactose intolerance, they're a bit like, is that really a thing? Like it's a bit like gluten intolerance, where they're like, I'm not really sure if that's really a thing yet.
Awesome. Cool. So yeah, we'll get to the next question, which is from Aidan Koch. And he has asked, I'd be curious to hear Menno's recommendation to help fix muscle imbalance between sides. For me, when performing any bilateral movements, I always feel my right quad/hamstrings and barely feel the left side. Even with unilateral movements, the left side eventually fatigues, but sensation/burn is much slower.
Hey, Pascal here. I just wanted to take the moment to talk about our membership site. Inside, you'll find a thriving forum, an extensive exercise library, courses, presentations, and research reviews. All I need you to do is hit the link in the description below and sign up.
So I wouldn't put too much stock in the sensation part, because people are limb dominance is a very real thing, and it changes per movement. So for example, a lot of people have, if you think of soccer or kicking, the left leg is more stable, but the right leg is more dexterous, more mobile. So if you want to kick a ball, then you'll use your right leg. But you can see that during some exercises where the left leg is used for stability, maybe Romanian deadlifts, for example, unilateral Romanian deadlifts, and some people actually prefer the left leg. So research also finds that the limb dominance is movement specific. And I wouldn't put too much stock into like how you feel the movement, because if you try riding with your left or right arm, it all feels very different. But for some tasks, what you want to do is see if there's objectively a difference in performance. So it's really important to measure if you're actually stronger. And also if there's actually a size discrepancy, because I can't recall how many clients I've had that say, yeah, my right arm is so much more dominant than my left arm. And I'm like, okay, let's do the measurement, test the strength. And it's like, it's actually the same size. And, it just looks a bit different. Like the insertion points may be a little bit different. Actually, it's the same size and your strength is really not that different. Like it's normal. There's always going to be a strength asymmetry. Like 1 or 2 reps is basically a non-issue for most people, sometimes even more than a few reps. But when you do have an asymmetry, what you want to do, so when you verify that objectively, basically, then you want to check how large it is. And if it's more than like I say, a few reps or in strength with a given weight, or there's like pronounced size difference, then what you want to do is see whether it's strength and size or only strength or only size. And what you can do then is train with different intensities. So if you have one side, for example, that's like, say your right side is a lot stronger, but it's roughly the same size. What you can do is you can train the right side of your body with higher reps, which will make it grow at the same rate, approximately, but gain less strength. So that the left side can catch up. You train it with lower reps, it gains the same amount of size, but it catches up in terms of strength development. In general, a good rule of thumb is always also to at least have some unilateral movements, like one arm, one leg movements in your program. Because if you only have bilateral movements, actually was a study on this, I think about a year ago, which showed that during a bench press, even in very trained individuals, there is still quite some asymmetry between sides, in which side is more active. And I think they also showed that it doesn't go away over time. Like it can actually become stronger. So, because if it's still, you're lifting one weight, the fact that you're using it with 2 arms, but it's still just one weight. So one side can compensate a bit for the other side. Even if the barbell stays relatively horizontal, which is of course also a big priority, make sure you're lifting symmetrically. And if you have those things in place, I think usually it's actually not a huge issue. And especially if you just equate volume with unilateral movements, otherwise you're creating the issue. If you do 8 reps with the weaker side, stick to 8 reps for the stronger side, typically. Then it usually doesn't become a big issue, and it corrects itself over time, especially for a natural trainee, because in the end, you just get to your natty max. And if it happens like 6 months later for the other side, it may actually not be a huge problem, especially if it's not a visual problem, because most research finds that strength asymmetry is not that strongly related to injury risk, not nearly as much as you would think, especially not in sports like bodybuilding and strength training. It's a bit of a different story in tennis and baseball and the like, which are asymmetrical sports to begin with. So that provides some, basically my method in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think it's really good that you have layers to it, where it's not just you asymmetrical or you're not, because I think it's like a lot of us have those slight asymmetries, which, like you said, kind of don't matter that much, or they're in our head. Whereas the extreme ones, I haven't dealt with many that have it as extreme as what kind of you laid out there, being like multiple reps or quite a lot of weight. Are they normally down to, I don't know, in your experience, is that normally like someone's been injured on one side and so it's become underdeveloped? Or is there, I guess most people don't find that they have that extreme of an asymmetry?
Yeah, it can also sneak up on you. Sometimes it's with injuries, but sometimes you see it in people that just have never really tested it. And then for the first time in their lives, they do their leg curls with one leg. And then they notice, whoa, I can do 10 more with one side.
Wow. Yeah.
So yeah, I think sometimes it's also just like one movement, and then it's just like a motor coordination issue. Okay. It doesn't actually have to be much of a problem. But sometimes there's also a pre-existing injury. I had when I dropped 400 pounds on my foot. It took a long time before my feet were equal in terms of calf raises again.
Yeah, I forget that you had that horrific. That was so horrific. So yeah, cool. We'll get to the next question then, which is from Scott. Why can't I say Scott's last name? I actually don't know how to pronounce his last name for some reason. Myslinski. He says, awesome, thanks. And please ask about and give your opinion, Steve. So maybe I'll give my opinion on the value of doing exercises in a circuit style with adequate rest versus all sets of one exercise, then another, etc. Yeah.
So I think I'm sort of in between. Like most people do straight sets, right? They do one exercise, they go to the bench press, they do one set, they rest a couple minutes, they do another set of bench press, rest a couple minutes, bench press, move to the next exercise. And then you have circuit training, which is mostly famous for women in boot camp classes and like the circuit training setups, which is like 10 machines in a circle, which is a completely unbalanced program that like 50 plus women typically also frequent, and they do the circle training at 10 reps to failure. So it has a very bad reputation in that regard. But if you just let go of the idea that it has to be a circuit without rest, then suddenly it works really well. So most people with supersets, like there's literally not even a word, not even exercise science for something like a superset, a triset, quad set, a circuit, but doing it with rest in between. So you do bench press, chin-ups, but it's not like you do the bench press and then you run to the chin-up rack and you do your chin-ups. It's just like bench press, catch your breath, rest a minute, do chin-ups, catch your breath, rest another minute, then do your bench press again. And that's what I'm actually a big fan of, because you can literally cut your time in half or less if you set up your workouts that way. And you can take advantage, although you then actually may need to rest briefly, with antagonist supersets. Antagonist potentiation seems to be a real thing. Like there are numerous studies showing it actually works. But it has to be within about a minute then. So it's not super practical. But mostly you just save a lot of time. And it also allows you to prioritize muscle groups more equally. Coming back to symmetrical development and stuff. Because research generally finds that if the later in your workout you do an exercise, the worse its strength gains. Especially if there are exercises before it exercising the same muscle group. Whereas if you do something like leg curls, squats, chin-ups, bench press, that's basically a full body workout, maybe lateral raises in between or something, then you can basically do it as a circuit, but with rest in between. I call them combo sets. Okay. So because there's literally not a word for it. So a combo set is basically like a superset or a circuit, but with rest in between. And yeah, it just saves a lot of time and it allows you to prioritize every exercise. It's not like, by the time you get to your bench press, you've already done 6 sets of squats.
No, that's really interesting, actually. I've never heard of, I've never heard, well, actually not heard of it. I know it, but I've never heard it described like that, where it's like, we know if the first exercise you do within a workout routine, I mean, you can just inherently know that's going to get the best from you because you're your freshest. So actually by spreading things a little bit more equally through the workout, you can kind of potentially get a bit from both. So I never thought about it like that. That's pretty cool. And yeah, like you described, when I hear circuit training, I think of like how gyms were first developed and all the machines, and they were kind of developed for you to just like go from one machine to the next machine and just like trot along, which has a bad reputation, probably for a good reason, for hypertrophy. But yeah, I've never used combo sets, and I tend to recommend for clients to do them kind of like, if you're doing bench, you do your bench, then you do your pull-ups, and then you go to what have you. I can see both absolutely working. I like the idea that, I guess you could argue that for an advanced individual or non-technique heavy lifts, there's not much of this, kind of like doing the same movement and kind of you're in the groove with that movement, so you don't kind of switch in between. I don't know if there's anything to kind of the build-up of, like, I know you're kind of down the mechanical tension route, kind of, so cell swelling and stuff like this, so you get a bit of a build up of metabolites if you kind of do all your bench in one go versus spreading it to another exercise. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think it basically comes down to rest intervals. So research at this point is quite strong that actually longer rest is better because it allows you to do more work. And with combo sets, especially if you do your whole workout in like one, actually I set up many of my workouts that way. Basically the whole workout is 1 or 2 combos. And that means you can have very long rest periods. So when I'm in the gym, actually, what I do now is I go to one exercise, I do one set, and then basically I just move to the next one. And by the time I get back to the first one, I've basically done half or a third of my workout if I do 3 sets per muscle group. And it means it might actually be like 10, sometimes 20 minutes rest for the same exercise. And I can, even then I have poor work capacity, so I won't hit the same amount of reps typically, but I can come very close. Whereas even after 2-3 minutes, sometimes my reps cut off in half. So I think actually it would be more of a benefit to have longer rest. And even if that comes with like less cell swelling and stuff.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I guess the in my head, I'm thinking you're that guy in the gym now that's like hogging every machine. I guess the practical
So I never
concerns.
hog anything. I just go from one to the next.
No, yeah.
And I move away. So
Cool.
I just see if it's still there.
That's interesting. I haven't heard anyone kind of describe it that way. So that gives me some food for thought for sure. So yeah, Scott asked another question where he said, what did he change his mind about after training / living with Dr. Mike? He says specifically, did he change his mind on the value of periodization / deloads, set progression at all?
It contributed to my bulking experience. I was already bulking before, but it actually contributed to bulking a bit longer. Having talked to Mike, he was also very much of the opinion that it can be beneficial to have these longer bulk phases, more like traditional bodybuilding, I guess. So that definitely played a role. We had a lot of good discussions on exercise technique. I think we're generally, with a lot of things, we're on board. We're both pretty strict on technique. Yeah, I mean, not like super big things. The meal frequency also, he definitely was on some camp. But funny enough, when I went with Mike, we were really good friends, and we talk about mostly non-fitness stuff.
Okay.
So it's actually really funny with Mike and I that we're known as having relatively big differences in opinion about training and nutrition, especially at the top level where you see that most people tend to converge more towards the same sides. But we have quite some differences of opinion. But if we talk about anything else, we have shockingly similar opinions. Like I actually I once joked, and I pretty much stand by that. Like if I had to nominate one person as president, like disregarding how they'd actually function politically, whatever, but just in terms of like opinions of society and how they would structure things, I would probably make Mike president. Like politically and philosophically, we have enormous overlap in beliefs.
Cool. No, that we need that as like a soundbite now, so that everyone can get that from you. That's really cool. I know I don't think you're as open with yours as he is. He shares his quite openly on Instagram and things. And that's cool that you align quite well. I think, that makes for good friendships, let alone the divergent opinions on kind of exercise science and everything, which I know you respect one another greatly, and you need that actually. I think it's great because that's what helps like evidence-based practice get further to the truth when people have different ideas. And I think people like black and white answers, but it's just not that way. And there's many, I guess, in some ways I hate this phrase, but it works well in this case, like many roads to Rome in some ways. So, he actually had one more question, and that was, how does Menno program differently for enhanced individuals?
More everything. So I also, sometimes I joke about enhanced lifters, but I actually think that like hardcore bodybuilding is much more serious and respectable even in that way when you're talking at the enhanced level, because you have more volume, more protein. I actually think protein the reason bodybuilders typically eat so much protein is because they're enhanced. And I think it actually works if you are enhanced. It makes sense, right? Because there's always this debate. Some people say, well, nitrogen retention is higher.
Yeah.
But protein breakdown rates are like this, because it's not like the body just breaks down protein for no reason. It breaks down protein to remodel the tissue typically, unless you're starving. And protein synthesis rates are like this. And enhanced, they're like this. So protein synthesis rates increase manyfold. And if you get a little bit of a decrease in protein breakdown, that's not going to change protein recommendations that much. So I think protein intakes for enhanced trainees are much higher. The energy surplus you can use, like this is something that anecdotally I stand by pretty strongly. I'm always very skeptical of what I see in my own clients, but when the lean bulk I talked about with natural trainees works super well. If you add more calories, you get the same thing what you see in research. You add a lot of fat and really not much muscle. Enhanced trainees, completely different story. You add more calories, weight rises more. Calipers still aren't budging. More calories, more weight gain. The calipers still aren't budging. So yeah, it's very different. It's just more aggressive in every way, like more volume, more calories, more protein, much more intensive training. I think the things like train twice a day, they become much more relevant when you're getting to that kind of training volume. So it's just, much more hardcore, basically.
That sounds about right. I know I have heard different opinions on the protein thing, which is really interesting. And actually that relates to someone else who had a question, which is about your kind of your recommendations on protein, whether they've changed in that. I think that they were saying that your opinion is normally lower than the general recommendations you see out there, like maybe less than 1 gram per pound, I assume then. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd say that it depends on what you define as like the general recommendations.
Yeah.
Because there hasn't been a single study still showing any benefits of more than 1.6 gram per kilogram per day protein under nutrient timing and energy controlled conditions. And I realized that last month there was a new meta-analysis seemingly showing benefits all the way up to, I think, 3.1 gram per kilogram per day. But it had, I think, 105 studies or something, and only 4 of those, not sure about the exact numbers, but something like that, only 4 of those actually had all factors equated within the same study. So that's kind of study where, are those benefits of protein, or is it just because when you add protein, you're also adding calories? It's a huge one. And you also see that studies where they add the protein, like post-workout, for example, if they didn't have post-workout feeding, or if they were training fasted in one group and they added protein pre-workout in the other, those things can also have an effect. So you're basically aggregating the benefits of more calories, better nutrient timing, and more protein. And that doesn't mean it was the protein that had the beneficial effects. So yeah, I still generally 1.8 gram per kilogram per day, except for like enhanced trainees, people with muscle memory, then I go higher.
Hi guys, Steve here. Just wanted to take a moment of your time to remind you of our online coaching service. At Revive Stronger, we pride ourselves on providing personalized service that will take your physique and knowledge to the next level. If you're interested, check the description and sign up. And with that, is that kind of all protein from every source, or is that kind of your high quality, good digestibility, full amino acid profile proteins?
Right. So this is something that I think a lot of people actually don't know, but traditional protein recommendations are based with the assumption that 50% of the diet's protein comes from high quality sources. So that's also exactly what I tell my clients. At least 50% of every meal's, it's per meal, right? Because, if one meal is only gelatin or something, it still cannot necessarily compensate for other meals. So it's 50% of each meal's protein target has to be from high quality sources. And this is typically not really much of an issue, except for vegans. Then it's a very serious issue, and then you get into very different protein recommendations depending on which foods exactly they do eat. For example, if they're okay with eating bivalves, or if they're lacto-ovo, or truly vegan, if they're supplementing protein powers.
Awesome. Yeah, and if people want to learn more about that, probably before this one comes out, I did a whole podcast with Eric Trexler on like vegans and protein recommendations and what they can do there. So it goes crazy in depth and all of that. So no, awesome. That was really interesting. So the next question is from Tracy Patterson, and she has said she's interested in your views on women training differently to men based on evolutionary differences, fiber types, energy sources, hormonal differences. In terms of us, well, actually, I'll let you answer. I think she's done some reading into some of your stuff. So yeah, she's just interested to hear you expand on that.
I typically have the same opinion on that I think women should train slightly differently than men on average. Main difference being they should do more reps for a few reasons. I think it's also a big practical issue in that women often, especially for something like a lateral raise or a movement where the lowest weight is relatively high, and the increment in weight, so it's like 5 pounds increases, can actually be really problematic. So it's much easier to go up in reps than to increase the weight. So I'm more a fan of what I call rep range progressions in women for that reason. And in men, I'm a big fan of trying to add weight whenever possible, because it's simply the most reliable way to tell someone's stronger. Like you can't fake a 50 pound increase in your bench. Like, density training and stuff, it's all like a bit iffy, has some considerations, but you can't, like I said, you can't fake a 50 pound increase in your bench. So that's a bit of a difference. Women tend to tolerate, even if only due to maybe it's just injury sensitivity, but definitely anecdotally and based on some research, scarce research, I might add, women can probably tolerate a few more sets per week than men. Overall, the differences aren't major. They can also rest a bit less long, but you should still auto-regulate it. One big difference that is not really practically relevant for me, but research actually shows is significant. Women respond quite poorly to sprint training. They get less protein synthesis, and they get more fatigue. So that's interesting. That's actually one area where it makes sense, because that's the prototypical area where everything that should be good in men is like for sprinting, and everything that should be good in women is more endurance oriented. So sprinting is like sort of the prototypical male activity in terms of genetic predisposition, at least. Other than that, I mean, all the same principles apply. It's not like I advocate being dumbbell training. It's like a few more reps, like slightly shorter rest periods, maybe a little bit more volume, maybe slightly higher fat intakes, burning a bit more fat, slightly lower carb. Protein, I don't decrease, even though research finds that you might be able to decrease it by, I think, 11%, one meta-analysis showed, but it wasn't statistically significant. So not big difference, but some subtle changes for sure.
Cool. Yeah, she actually went on to ask, and you may have covered this in what you're just saying because I haven't been able to. She says, what would be a good place to start in terms of volume if you have a general recommendation, and how to determine when to progress volume when setting up a program for an early intermediate who's been spinning their wheels, perhaps not pushing hard enough for fear of overtraining, not being able to recover for the next session, etc.
So typically I actually set the starting volume the same as for men. Like I would basically act in terms of volume calculations as if they were male. But then I look at their work capacity, which I do for every client. And if I see that, like most women have, they have better work capacity than men, which means their reps may go like 8, 8, 7, 7. Whereas for a male at equivalent strength level, etc., it might be more like 8, 6, 5. So 8, 6, 5, 4. And if you see that, then you can probably add some volume, especially to those exercises that have really good work capacity. I think work capacity is one of the most sensible things to really look at in your clients, because it tells you a lot. It can also tell you if they're training seriously, because if it goes like 8, 11, 4, then you're like, I think we need to work on either technique or training efforts. But if you see it's really high, it means objectively there is little neuromuscular fatigue. Also good if a client, for example, says, I think I may be overreaching or overtraining. And if you see, well, actually you're progressing in strength and your work capacity shows, which is in research also called fatigue index, not much fatigue, maybe 10% fatigue. If you go from 8 to 4 reps, it's 50% fatigue index. So that typically, if you're over 50% fatigue index, that's quite high. If you're under 20%, that's low. So those are some decent rules of thumb. And based on that, you can see where you can probably handle volume a bit more or less.
That's really interesting, actually. I think you've spoken it on the podcast before, actually, because I recognized that from you before. So that's really cool. Just in terms of, obviously you said about the reps dropping off, is that with the same load, targeting the same kind of reps in reserve? Or I think you actually use something different, like reps to failure or something, I think you use.
Yeah, I call it reps to failure. Reps in reserve is basically the same thing, just depends on how you define it. Because if you say like 0 reps to failure, I define as failure. And then 1 rep to failure is you do every rep you can. I think it's just slightly more intuitive, because if you do 0 reps in reserve, does that mean you're actually training to failure, or you're just doing every rep you can? So it's basically the same thing as reps in reserve, which is a big improvement over rating of perceived exertion. Because if you're actually just rating perceived exertion, it's very fallible. Like it changes with, if you're listening to music, changes between individuals, where some people are like, it's just a flesh wound, I wasn't numb. And other people are like, it's unbearable, I couldn't push for another possible rep. They give it a very different RPE rating, even though they're both going 1 rep to failure. So it's basically the same thing as RIR.
Yeah. So is that, sorry, just to confirm, was that so that in those examples, it's the same load for the same reps to failure?
Yeah. You need to do the same weight. Otherwise, you have no information pretty much.
Yeah.
You technically also need to standardize the rest interval. But my experience is that if you tell people to rest until they feel recovered to perform maximally again, which is what I often do if time is not a limiting factor, then it's consistent enough. Like research also typically shows that people are relatively consistent. They do tend to rest longer as they get fatigued later to the end of the workout, but it's not a huge difference, and people do it very similarly.
Cool. Perfect. Right, we get to the next question. So actually, I don't think I did ask this, but there was a time when it came up where I almost did. So it was RSD, and he asks, does Menno ever add sets week to week? What criteria does he use if he does? So I guess you maybe just answered that.
Yeah. So I'm not a big fan of like block periodization, I guess you could call it, where you're just sort of ramping up sets. So I use different methods from Mike, for example, in this regard. But I use things like work capacity to see if we add a set. And then typically that set's there to stay for at least a certain period and to evaluate how they respond to that. Okay. Actually, I'm generally a big fan of looking at more long-term changes to see how someone responds, because I think it's so difficult to see in 1 week if someone's handling a particular volume well or not.
Cool, perfect. The next question is from Instagram, actually. So I pulled a bunch from there. Actually, one of them, because we've talked about it, I'm going to ask it. Would you ever go vegan? I'm actually interested to know as well.
No, probably not. Like for what reason? Like ethically or like performance wise, or basically none of them.
Yeah, I know. For me, it's very challenging as a bodybuilder, actually, because like you said,
yes,
there's a lot of complications. It's getting better. I'm waiting for where they can like synthetically create actual like meat products through like test tube. I've forgotten what it's called, where they can like grow it in a lab or whatever. Then I'll be like, cool, I can go like fake vegan. I guess that would be kind of, well, it would be pure vegan if you wanted it to be.
Yeah, I think also environmentally and ethically, there are some things you can say for both sides. But main thing environmentally is that the production method of the meat is much more important than eating meat or not. So you can actually make meat very sustainable. In like, I don't know the details, but you can make a certain farm or ecosystem set up in a certain way that's actually very sustainable, and you're still eating meat.
Do you have much knowledge on the ethical side? I'm just interested. I don't know if it's something that it's like something you've looked into a major.
Yeah, there are quite some arguments you can make for both things. Well, one big thing to note is that also environmentally, the effect of eating meat is not that large. And especially if you factor in if someone uses good production methods. So if you compare it, for example, to using the dryer, I think using the dryer statistically on average is like 3 or 5 times more influential. If you're using a car, also similar story, much more influential. And which also, if we're looking at it, it becomes very difficult, I think, when you're basing life decisions on environmental impact as an individual, because having a child is by far like literally, if you look at a graph of like a few things like dryer and stuff like this, and then having a child is like here, because you're creating another human being that for approximately 80 years is going to produce carbon dioxide and various other methane gas or whatever, and they're also going to use the dryer, they're also going to use a car, they may not be vegan, and etc. So if you really wanted to, like if your main argument was we all should live in such a way not to put any strain on the environment, then by that benchmark, someone that has, say, 2 children is always going to be a worse person than someone that has 1 child and actually uses a dryer, takes the car, eats lots of meat. So I'm not sure how well you can use it. Also ethically, in terms of like animals, I think most ethical systems, they move more towards like the Bible and Kant's a categorical imperative, basically act towards others as you would want them to act towards you. Well, animals have absolutely zero issue with killing you and eating you. So in that regard, there's also the question of whether you should spare life. And then if you spare life, where do you draw the line? Should we spare insects, for example? What about things that actively hunt on us, like bugs that have malaria, or insects? So I think it's a bit gray, and it can certainly be admirable to go vegan, but there's also definitely people that do it for that reason and see it more as like a virtue signaling and parade with it, and that I'm definitely not a fan of.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's interesting because it's in my life quite a bit because my girlfriend's vegan, and so like I see it a fair bit, and obviously it's just getting bigger and bigger. So I'm always interested, especially from an evidence-based perspective, because unfortunately a lot of like we see like the Netflix documentaries and things like this, and it's not a good source of information for it. So I'm always, I've done a ton of digging, so I'm always interested to hear someone who has an evidence-based perspective, where they lie with it. So very interesting to hear your thoughts. I think we probably have time for one more question. So actually this, I guess, it lies into something we were talking about already. It was, how do you define failure? And then how much fatigue difference between, as say, 0 RAR to 1 to 2 to 3?
Right, that's a good question, actually. So a lot of people, when you talk about failure, they don't really define what they mean by failure. And typically, it's because when you just say failure, researchers typically mean by that what they call momentary muscle failure, which means it's not about effort or anything, like it's objectively impossible to complete another rep. That's momentary muscle failure. So the muscle is simply incapable of producing the amount of force needed to move a given resistance against gravitational resistance. So, or given weight against gravitational resistance. You have to separate that, which is also a little bit of an artificial construct, right? Because there are scenarios maybe where, you know, is it really physical? Or if you had put a gun to someone's head, they could have done another rep. And then there is, which brings you to volitional failure, which is the point people stop us at. And volitional failure is a big issue in exercise science because it varies a lot between individuals. So there are people where they're already doing partials, for example, with chin-ups, and they're like, the chin's still like getting there, it's close, like I'm not at failure yet. And there are people like, whew, I'm getting a sweat, I'm done, like I hit failure, you know? So volitional failure is a much more subjective indicator, and it is very strongly affected by someone's motivation level. So in terms of like reps in reserve, reps to failure, it can be much more variable. Momentary muscle failure is relatively consistent because you need pretty extreme measures, like putting a gun to someone's head to really affect it, if you can affect it at all. And like I said earlier, you need some method. If you're using RIR, reps to failure, you need to define what actual failure is. Because like I say, if you're saying no reps in reserve, does that mean like actual momentary muscle failure? Or does that mean you're just not doing any reps you think you can do? And then also the question is, how experienced are they? If you think you can do another rep, does that mean there's a high likelihood that you actually couldn't do that rep? And the best way to learn that, in my experience, is simply experience. So you just need to go to failure in your training career. And then typically once you've learned that, it's a skill that you, a bit like bicycle riding, it's you know the feeling and you have a pretty good idea. So it doesn't have to be super complicated. But it is definitely important to know these definitions, both for interpreting research and for instructing clients on how much they should push themselves.
Yeah, no, definitely. Because I think I maybe even asked Brad kind of like, what's the definition of failure? And he was like, there isn't actually one definition within research. There's like, like different people and different researchers have taken people in different ways within studies. So even I think it was interesting that like sometimes people obviously, and I guess in studies this has been shown, where people aren't truly going to what they believe is failure. It's almost like, oh, maybe we can even leave more in reserve than we thought as advanced training. Who knows if it's applicable, I guess.
Yeah, this is a big pet peeve of mine, in that sometimes it's implicitly wrong in research, because you see a study protocol, for example, that said subjects completed 4 sets of 8 reps at 8 RM training to failure. And that's impossible, right? There is no way, if it's your actual 8 RM, you can do it once, maybe twice. Maybe women sometimes can do it 3 times with 10-minute rest in between, but there's almost no individual on the planet that's actually going to be able to lift their 8 RM 4 times in a row, and especially not if it's like 2-minute rest periods. So it's really annoying, because then you don't really know where it's wrong. Like, were they just not hitting their 8 RM? Like, were the reps dropping off? And then if that's the case, they count it as 8 reps in terms of the volume tracking, because if it was volume equated, then that changes things. So yeah, that's a big issue still in research.
I assume, Menno, you also, when you're talking about failure, it's kind of like, I guess, form failure also comes into it. Is that something I imagine you're a fan of?
Yeah, you can also define technical failure, which is the point at which your technique breaks down. It's also a little bit more subjective / arbitrary, because you have to define what good technique is. And a lot of people will mistake velocity with good technique, in my experience. So they will stop when bar speed starts slowing down a lot. And that's not necessarily bad technique. In fact, it's a prerequisite for maximum mechanical tension in the muscle fibers, because fibers cannot produce maximal tension and move at high velocity at the same time. They're inversely correlated. So yeah, if you define it well, for example, I definitely say that you should stop squatting, for example, if your back starts rounding. But then there's also the issue of, did your back start rounding because you weren't paying attention to it? Or is that really what happens when you're going to failure? Because if you look at high-level lifters, they don't reach technical failure typically before they reach muscle failure. They just reach muscle failure. So I'm not a fan of using technical failure, because often it simply means that someone's, either it's mindset or technique that needs to work on, but it's not a reliable measure of proximity to actual failure.
That's really interesting. It's very true. If people aren't concentrating, it's easy to fail way before your muscles have actually given up, because you've just misgrooved it because you weren't concentrating on the set at hand. So that's actually a really good point. Cool. Menno, we have come to an hour now. So yeah, thank you for this great chat. It's been really cool doing this Q&A with you. Hopefully, and everyone's enjoyed it, I'm sure. If people want to kind of keep up with you, I'm sure majority of them are already following you over on social media and over at your website, and they know where that is, but so they know. Mm-hmm. And if you have anything exciting to announce or anything like that, I know you said you've got your diet break study coming out.
Yeah, got a couple of studies coming up. My book's probably going to be released this year. It's not going to be about anything we discussed. It's going to be about the science of self-control, but I'm excited about that. But yeah, like mennohenselmans.com or Menno Henselmans on Facebook/Instagram. You can follow everything I'm up to.
Fantastic. I'll make sure that's linked below. And when I think I've heard you speak about this book. When is the book out?
Still not determined. I'm at the last edit stage. It's pretty much fully written. Referencing is complete. Working with Amazon now to set up
awesome.
typesetting and stuff. Yeah.
And is that, just if I can ask, is it nutritional focused, like self-control for nutrition, or is it just like in life in general?
It's life in general, but there's a specific chapter on diet adherence.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, I think I might have to drag you back on to dig into that when that comes out and I can have a look at it.
Sure.
But for now, thank you so much for coming on, and we'll talk to you soon, guys. Take care. So I'm Steve Hall, founder of Revive Stronger and a coach of Revive Stronger.
My name is Pascal Floor. I'm the co-owner of Revive Stronger and also a coach, of course.
Revive Stronger has probably been going solidly for 3 years, roughly about 3 years.
Revive Stronger, to me, it is becoming kind of my child, my foster child. It's the gathering and getting together of like-minded people.
We've been expanding the coaching team, which is helping us help more people, but each coach can only help a certain number of people.
Right now, it's all over the place. We have YouTube, we have Facebook, we have Instagram, but there isn't that community aspect behind that.
And so the next step for us is developing a membership site.
So basically, we want to create a family and a community that is then benefiting from another.
A really cool community for people within our little niche is going to be a website.
They will get early access to our podcast.
You can access us, ask us questions.
The community aspect, we have a forum there. You can ask questions, but also you can log your journey.
There's also going to be courses on there.
Courses, presentations on different topics. Discount of past seminar footage. We will log our journey as well. We'll start vlogging.
We're going to have documentaries.
Our entire athletic journey. Furthermore, they get access to an exercise video library.
The exercises that we love for hypertrophy and maximizing hypertrophy, we're going to go through those in depth, telling you how to execute them.
We kept them concise and also mobile friendly so that you can watch them in between your sets.
I'm super excited to grow this community. The amount of value that we're going to be delivering is huge, and I'd love you to be part of it.
You will get so much out of that.
I'll see you inside.